Imagine this. You enter a room where a portrait of someone close to you always hung, someone who has long since left this world. You have grown accustomed to this image, to their gaze, which seemed to always be with you, offering the warmth of memories. But on this day, something has changed. The portrait no longer hangs in its place. It is neatly placed on your table, as if someone intentionally set it there to remind you. Coincidence? Or a sign? Or another scenario. Suddenly, you are overwhelmed by an inexplicable unease, a worry without a visible cause. Your heart tightens as though it senses an impending disaster. Later, you find out that at that exact moment, a person close to you passed away. How can this be explained? Intuition, a fantasy, or something greater? Such stories are not isolated cases. Many people report similar occurrences and wonder, is it possible that the soul does not vanish without a trace, but continues to exist in another form, sending signs to the living? One person who dedicated his life to searching for answers to these questions was Professor Michail Pogodin, a man of science, a historian, and a thinker, who could not ignore the many testimonies of unusual phenomena that contradicted conventional logic. However, the decisive impulse for his research was a personal tragedy, the loss of his wife. "A year ago, I lost my wife. This tragedy led me to search for answers. The cases I collect prove that our life is just part of a greater journey," said Pogodin. After her death, he began to study all the known testimonies about life after death in depth. The more he delved into this topic, the more stories he found. People told him about strange coincidences, inexplicable encounters, and signs they had received from their deceased loved ones. The story of Professor Ivan Simonov is one such example shared by Professor Ivan Simonov from Kazan University. He was a man with a strict mindset, a proponent of rational thinking and the scientific method. Yet, even he had to reconsider when something happened to him. It all started with a letter. Simonov received a message from his teacher and benefactor, Professor Litrov, who had once been the first lecturer in astronomy at Kazan University. Litrov inquired about how Simonov was doing and how he was managing his tasks at the department. He awaited a response. However, Simonov, preoccupied with daily matters, put the letter aside. A week passed. One day, when he entered his office, he noticed that the portrait of Litrov, which had always hung on the wall, was now on his desk. Simonov approached and examined the portrait closely. It had hung on the wall for many years, securely fastened with a strap. How could it have fallen now? Upon checking the hanging system, the professor discovered that the strap had indeed torn. However, that didn't explain the strange feeling that came over him upon seeing it. At that moment, he remembered the letter from Litrov, which he had never responded to. Was it a coincidence that on the very day he thought of his teacher again, the portrait lay before him, as if it were reminding him of his duty? Without further hesitation, Simonov sat down at his desk and wrote a reply. Weeks passed. One day, he received a letter from Litrov's son. The letter stated that the professor had passed away. It was the date of death that finally shook Simonov. Litrov had died on the very day the portrait had fallen in his office. This event caused the professor to reflect. If he had been a superstitious person, he might have considered it an undeniable sign. However, even with his skeptical mindset, he could not deny the strangeness of the occurrence. He told Michail Pogodin about it, who asked him to write down all the details and send him copies of the letters. Pogodin kept these documents and regarded them as valuable evidence of the connection between the worlds. The Whisper in the Wind, an equally astonishing story, was shared by Michail Pogodin's acquaintance, Alexandra Lewaschowa. She was the wife of the military commander Nikita Fyodorovich Lewaschow, who served in the Irkutsk Hussar Regiment. Upon learning of his death, Alexandra immediately went to the village where he had passed away to bid him farewell. When their carriage arrived at the destination, she and her daughter decided to walk a bit along a street alley. The air was calm and peaceful, but suddenly Alexandra felt a strange movement in the air, as if something had flown past her. At that moment she clearly heard her name, a soft, barely audible whisper, as if someone had spoken it right next to her. Her daughter, walking beside her, suddenly stopped, her eyes widening in astonishment. "Did you hear that?" Alexandra asked. "Yes," replied the daughter. "Someone called your name." They turned around, but there was no one nearby. Only the trees rustled quietly with their leaves, and the wind gently brushed their faces. Alexandra later learned that at the very moment she heard the whisper, the funeral mass for her husband was being held. Could this have been his final farewell? The vision at the window, a similar inexplicable incident occurred to Awdotja Petrowna Jelagina. She had lived a long life and seen many things, but what happened on one of the autumn evenings remained forever etched in her memory. She was sitting by the window, staring thoughtfully at the street. The day was drawing to a close, the sun slowly setting, casting everything in warm, golden light. Jelagina was enjoying this quiet moment when, suddenly, she noticed movement at the edge of her field of vision. She quickly turned her head and froze. Standing in the doorway was her old friend, Maria Andrejewna Protasova. Her figure was as graceful as in her youth, and a gentle smile adorned her face. "Maria!" Jelagina called out, leaping up to embrace her friend. But at that very moment, the vision disappeared as if it had dissolved into the air. Awdotja Petrowna felt her heart race. Had she imagined it? Or was it a play of light? She sat there for a long time, lost in thought, until she received the news. Maria Andrejewna had died that very night, the night Jelagina had seen her in her house. The bridge between worlds. The more Michail Pogodin collected such stories, the more his belief grew that death is not the end. He began to think more frequently about the connection between worlds and the signs that we sometimes fail to notice. These reflections led him to an intriguing conclusion. If the soul of a person continues to exist after death, then life in this world is merely preparation for something greater. "We shed our garment," he said, "but what clothing awaits us afterward? What will our new form be like? What role will our actions in this life play?" He was convinced that every person should be aware of their responsibility for the days they spend. If a new life awaits us, it is important to prepare for it with dignity and to leave a good impression. Why are we here? Many philosophers and theologians have sought answers to these questions, but Pogodin believed that such reflections should not be reserved only for the chosen few. Sooner or later, every person comes into contact with the eternal questions of existence. If there is another life, why are we here? What role do we play? Do we really exist only to go from birth to death, leaving nothing behind? He asked himself. For him, the answer was obvious. Life was not simply given to us. It is a school, a preparatory step, where we are meant to learn, grow, and become better. The voice of conscience. But how can one understand what exactly to do? How can one distinguish right from wrong? Michail Pogodin's answer was simple. Listen to your conscience. It is the only true compass that guides us through life. We may err, we may stray from the path, but the conscience always shows us the right direction. These reflections filled his life with deep meaning. He no longer sought proof of the soul's existence. For him, they were already evident. Now, he pondered another question. How can we learn to live in such a way that we have no fear of what awaits us on the other side? The final secret until his last days, Michail Pogodin continued to collect stories, testimonies, and letters. He became increasingly certain that the world is more complex than it seems. Perhaps after death, there is more than just oblivion awaiting us. Each of the stories he collected showed that death is not the end. And if that's the case, then perhaps we should think about this. Are we living in a way that we will have no regrets about the days we've lived? If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to give a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. What do you think of these mysterious phenomena? Do you believe the soul lives on after death? Let's discuss it in the comments.